Greetings, dear listeners. This is Jonah Goldberg, host of the Remnant Podcast, brought to you by the Dispatch and Dispatch Media. Another first-time guest today. You know, when people often accuse me, suggest, praise, condemn, allude to the fact that I'm some sort of expert on the history of conservatism. I'm not. I might be to you, but I'm not in the grand scheme of things. And so one of the people I consider to be that is Richard Reinsch. He's here. You've been in a bunch of places of late, but you are now you're now the editor-in-chief of the Civitas Institute at the University of Texas, Austin.
Yes.
And you are also shepherding a new journal, working with my former colleague and your current colleague, Ryan Streeter.
Yes.
On this new journal called Civitas Outlook. But you've moved around in various institutions of conservatism, leaving them better off. And I thought it would be a sort of a good moment to level set. Highly recommend our mutual friend Steve Hayward has got a great piece that I just read this morning on the future conservatism over there. I got to get Steve back on here at some point. So welcome to the Remnant.
Well, thank you. Thank you for that introduction. I appreciate it. I have been at a number of institutions, and the promising development at the University of Texas, Austin, both the School of Civic Leadership and the Civitas Institute, which is, to my knowledge, the only state or state-based university conservative think tank. You know, the Hoover Institution obviously is very well known. That's a think tank at a university, but at Stanford, we're at the University of Texas, and our task, as we see it, somewhat grandiloquently, is to reforge the American consensus around both the growth of economics, the relational capacity civil society has to lift us, sort of out of radical individualism and out of egalitarianism, and also constitutional government itself. And so it's both economic growth, but also constitutional foundations and civil society. And so we want to put forward those ideas to people again, as they seem to be at one measure old hat, but also forgotten in our current debate.
Yeah, I mean, so I've had this long-standing argument. I mean, it goes back. I can't remember the first place I wrote about it. It was 30 years ago. That we don't need new, think tanks and magazines are different creatures. So put those two aside. We don't need new conservative institutions. We need to take back existing institutions. We need to sort of have a sort of fighting wedge inside of them. And this was in the context back in the day, in the 90s, there was this whole talk about how, because look at the success of Fox News, we can create our own parallel media institutions. We can create look at Hillsdale College. We can create our own universities.
Mm-hmm.
And I think, Hillsdale back then was doing great stuff. I thought Fox News actually back then was doing great stuff. But the value but just like you can't have new old friends, you can't have new old institutions. And so creating ways in which to claw back a place inside existing venerable institutions is really, really important. And what you guys are doing at UT is one example of it. What my friend Ben Sass has been doing at Florida with Will, not anymore, but Will Inboden, who was at UT before, all sort of flowing from the Robbie George example. This seems like a much better way of engaging the problem with these institutions than, because my shorthand for it is, if you're a rich conservative orthodontist in New Rochelle, you'd still want to send your kid to Harvard, even if you're going to complain about it, than send them to some, to Hillsdale, right? Just because there's a status thing that comes with old institutions like that. And so, I know that's not necessarily your mission plan, but it's one of the reasons why I greet the things that you guys are doing and stuff like going to University of Arizona and other places with a lot more optimism than this alternative parallel institutions thing, because the whole point, as you're just described, is it's our culture too, right? The common culture is our culture, And the idea that conservatives can just do the Benedictine option, that Roger talks about, and just recede from everything, is basically ceding the whole of society to people that you consider to be running it into the ground.
No, I agree with you completely, and it's also we see legislatures in we'll say red states and more conservative states wanting to and recognizing that they have a problem with higher education. They I think have not thought seriously about sort of their flagship state universities seriously in terms of trying to have an impact there. And part of that we understand is that the university is supposed to be the university and not subject to political interference. And yet, as we've seen on university campuses, particularly since I was there in law school and undergrad over 20 years ago, things have gotten worse. The progressive mindset on campus is now much more dogmatic and much more exclusionary. I think that also fuels a lot of things we're seeing in terms of the quote unquote the new right, which is heavily young men. I think it stems from a lot of their experiences on campus. And so I think the state legislatures look at this and have decided we need to have some way, some salutary way to enlarge the debate. And that's not, and so these centers are not designed to be, I want to say ghettos on campus, but sort of open-ended invitations to further dialogue and debate amongst students and faculty, and to bring in new speakers that you wouldn't necessarily hear all the time on campus. So, I think within that, the Civitas Institute, our mission is both. It's both. It's Texas, it's the United States, and it's global, and it's around these core ideas of freedom and virtue, of economic growth, of equality under law, and the exceptional nature of the human person that needs to be defended as it is being sort of corroded by identity politics, critical race theory, et cetera.
So I want to talk about that. So I'm a longtime critic of horseshoe theory, who's basically come around to thinking, oh crap, there's a lot of merit to this. And I think the two positions. I think the reason I changed my mind, what's the thing that Keynes says? When the facts change, I change my mind. Right?
Mm-hmm.
I think the facts have changed. The old arguments for horseshoe theory were basically a way of saying, the extreme right and the extreme left are wrong, and me, vital center liberal Arthur Schlesinger types, were right about everything. And that's why I disliked it, because up until fairly recently in mainstream conservative, the further right you went, the more in favor of limited government you were, the more you embraced free market economics, right? There, up until very recently, if you were referring to a conservative economist, you were referring to a libertarian economist, Milton Friedman, Thomas Sowell, that kind of thing.
Yeah.
And the problem is that as the right has abandoned a lot of those classical liberal commitments, parts of the right, I don't want to say the right, but the elements of the right have abandoned it, particularly in the Republican Party. The illiberalism of the right looks at many touch points much more like a convergence to the illiberalism of the left. And so my first question for you is how seriously should we take this? Is this a fad? Is this a moment? Is this the end of the long tail of populism, and eventually the right is going to find its muscle memory? Our friend Steve Hayward compares the NatCons today to the Reformicons of 10 years ago, which is a very hopeful way of viewing it if you want the NatCons to go to the way of the dodo, because no one talks about the Reformicons anymore either. Where do you see this going? What's your own take on the future of conservatism?
No, so I think in a lot of ways, I mean, there's been a rhetorical move the last few years to sort of say there's a complete break between the conservatism of Ronald Reagan or Milton Friedman or Frank Meyer. Fusionism conserved nothing. The country has continued to skate down sort of a progressive path, and we need to have an entirely new set of ideas and a much more muscular, aggressive conservatism, and one that's also heavily driven by populism. And I would just caution and say, if we think about conservatism in America from the post-war period forward, it was always heavily populist. It was always forged in political battles and, very aggressive attempts to stop what were seen as anti-American movements. And so you think about, the first major one that comes to mind is Whittaker Chambers contesting Alger Hiss, because he said, I know because I was a part of it, there was communist infiltration in the federal government. That was a major moment, 1950 with the Alger Hiss trial. A lot of people have kind of forgotten that, but it was a major moment. You've got the entire McCarthy period. You've got Bill Buckley defending McCarthy, Wilmore Kendall, a professor at Yale, saying McCarthy was right, and actually we can't have an open-ended society. It's got to be built around a definite orthodoxy, or it will lose its way. School prayer battles, school busing battles, the fallout from not the second wave of the civil rights movement, which became very egalitarian and opened the pathway to diversity and identity politics and all of that. That's something we've pushed against. So I would say these battles, I think there is more of a through line than people want to acknowledge. I think it's because it's convenient and it helps things that they might want to do now. But conservatism has always, I think, had this muscular, aggressive push. What I argue, and I think there are really smart people, much smarter than me, have emphasized this. People like Harry Jaffa, Charles Kessler, among others, is American conservatism ultimately has to ask itself what it's conserving, and what it's conserving has to be rooted in the American constitutional tradition and American citizenship, and it cannot be merely tax cuts or merely certain convenient tools for political power of the moment. And I think that's sort of the question. I think Stephen Hayward's piece opens us up to that. The one that we've got online today is like, what is this going to be about? And we don't know. I mean, I think it was a good thing that the left lost the election in November, and yet what that means is by no means a certainty that it's going to be positive for those of us who call ourselves conservative.
Yeah, I mean, I think you can summarize it. My view is it's good that the left lost. It's just a shame that the right won. Is how I feel about it. And there are days where I'm more glad the left lost than I am sad that the right won, and there are days where I feel the other way, because it depends. I mean, just to give, because I wanted to talk to you about this. Donald Trump last night posted on Truth. I think it is so on the nose that if you were writing a satirical novel, that the guy who has overturned traditional American conservatism created a social media site for the post-truth era where he posts truth on Truth Social to post more posts about post-truthism. I mean, it's just so on the nose. But he said he has the greatest mandate of any president in 129 years.
Yeah.
And everybody I know, because I shouldn't say everybody I know, a lot of people in my circles who know like what America was 129 years ago are like, what? McKinley? Who? What? Like it's the 44th largest electoral college win in American history, which the way I've been putting it is it wasn't a landslide, but it was decisive. He won all the swing states. He clearly won. He won the plurality. He won He won the popular vote. And one of the things that the Electoral College is supposed to do is make small popular vote wins look larger, so that it gives you some more, momentum to be president for the whole country. I'm fine with all of that. I don't know what the hell he's talking about the 129 years ago, but I was wondering, where do you come down on this question of mandates? Are there mandates? When we were on this panel together, you reminded me of an essay that I went back and read afterwards from Wilmore Kendall about congressional majorities and presidential majorities, which I think is a good sort of touchstone here. But like, what is your view on the mandate idea?
Yeah, no, the idea of a mandate coming. So I think, I've seen a lot of people online kind of parrot this idea that Donald Trump has a mandate. I think what they mean by that is we have the momentum and will that we need to repudiate the progressive agenda of the last 4 years. In a more broad sense, the idea of a mandate coming out of an election is a progressive idea. It's
Right.
thoroughly rooted in how they thought of American institutions being shaped by popular will on the one hand, and then the precise policy direction being handled by the administrative state that they wanted to be erected through executive control of the government largely. And so the idea of our founders is not mandate elections. Elections are an opportunity for deliberation,
Right.
and forging consensus, which should have a rough approximation to the people. Right, our institutions are rooted in the Republican principle, but constitutional duties are given to officers to write laws, make decisions, come to agreement, and compromise. And that seems to be completely lost and foreign to our politics now. So I don't fault people for thinking that this is alien to us, but it's a measure of how much progressive thinking even dominates the minds of a lot of conservative commentators, particularly those online and who are pro-Trump, who can't conceive to think, actually, we have a constitution, as Yuval Levin in his wonderful book American Covenant articulates. The Constitution itself is rooted in the recognition that we are a very different, diverse people who contest a lot of ideas, and it wants to try and make a system work through forcing us all to come to an agreement by the way the institutions and the elections and all of that are configured. And that sense is clearly being lost. And so if you think about, you have a Congress with, I don't know, it changes by the day. I think the Republicans barely have a majority or a one vote majority. You have a Senate 53 to 47, and you're going to have an administration that, as far as I can tell, through the cabinet picks, is going to be riven with contradictions and at cross purposes with itself. Really, what we should be looking to is a Congress that could find ways who are sort of Democrats and Republicans who could find different points of agreement and forge sort of a policy path one way. And I don't think that's going to happen. We'll have maybe one or two pieces of legislation come out of this presidency rooted in budgets and spending, and then Trump will try and do a lot of things through executive orders and cabinet rule and executive rules. And that'll be kind of it. And that's the limits of our politics right now. It's thankfully upheld by the Constitution, but the limits of a politics that is solely about we win, they lose. And in our constitutional tradition, if you have that mindset, there's actually very little you're going to win in an enduring sense.
Yeah. Tevi Troy, just for listeners' edification, friend of the pod, has a good piece in the latest commentary about how the passage of Obamacare, really,
beautiful.
It didn't so much create this problem, but it accelerated and entrenched this problem of trying to run government like a parliamentary system with straight party line votes. And this is one of the problems in a two-party system, is when one party breaks norms, the other party doesn't. It gives itself permission to break norms too, and you get a cascade of mirroring of each other. And you see this, the example I always use is on the culture war stuff, where I'm one of the guys responsible for introducing Saul Alinsky into the conversation. And but I said he was a bad guy, but he was really good at using power, and Alinskyite methods were bad, but and then you could just see, through in the mind of Dinesh and some other people, they're like, well, they keep winning, we keep losing, which again is not true, but like they keep winning, we keep losing. They're Alinskyites. We need to be Alinskyites too, but for our purposes. And you can see this kind of power worship thing say, well, the Democrats got Obamacare by doing these stuff. That's how we got to do it too. And it becomes more and more entrenched. And Wilmer Kendall was one of the guys who, to get back to this congressional versus presidential majority thing, he's one of the guys who actually believed that it was good for America to have a sufficient number of conservatives in the Democratic Party and a sufficient number of liberals in the Republican Party, so that the two parties could figure out how to do these transactions, right? It would be better if they were defined by interests and regions than by ideology. Is it possible? Why don't you explain the difference between a presidential majority and a congressional majority? And then I want to ask, do you think it's possible we can get back to thinking that congressional majorities are more important
Yeah.
in defining than presidential ones?
Yeah, I mean, Kindle, beautiful essay on the two types of majorities, and the presidential majority. He's writing this in, I believe, in the early 1960s or late 1950s, and he says the presidential majority is an elite majority. It's forged by certain corporations, higher education, foundations, and is about ideals and sort of gesturing to try and formulate an American idea that enough voters will glom onto. And a congressional majority is necessarily local, and it's regional, and it's related to what do the business owners in your district think? What do people? What does the bishop think? What do certain natural leaders in your community think? And you are trying to find ways to represent and appeal to them, and that's a different kind of politics. If you start from the ground up, and then you bring that into Washington, and then you have like multiple points, multiple ways to interlock and agree with those from different constituencies and different regions,
Right.
because there's just a greater tactile and a greater rootedness of what you're representing. And the presidential majority is very different. And I think Kindle's essay, although obviously we're now 70 years forward, still has a lot of resonance with how our politics works. Now, you say every national issue is a local issue. There really are no local issues anymore. That's what I continue to hear. And yet, I live in Northeast Ohio. Things seem there are a lot of local concerns here. There are a lot of ways of dealing with local concerns in Northeast Ohio that I think aren't helpful, but there they are. They exist. And if that is the way you move forward, it's also a way of realizing, I mean, national ideals, presidential majorities that Kindle was saying, also become a politics that's unmanageable, necessarily because you start promising things that really no one can achieve and that the federal government can't deliver. Congressional majority becomes it's a much more limited politics. It is transactional, and it's something that a lot of different people can come together around. Now it's sort of like the situation we're in right now. We have major problems, spending being one, entitlements being one, that we can't even remotely address. Not even the fact that there's not popular will to address it, but there's not even a way to speak, reform, and refine that popular will through congressional leadership, because of this politics that we're in. This sort of divisive politics prevents that process from happening. So we're becoming ungovernable on major problems.
Yeah, I mean the congressional majority idea. I mean, one of the reasons why I keep harping on this idea about how Congress needs to do its job is that Congress is where politics is supposed to happen, right? It's where it's where the differences between regions and cultures and interests and sectors of the economy and denominations and all these kinds of things, where all that stuff happens. And if politics is happening there, it prevents it from happening elsewhere. And part of the problem with our political culture these days is that politics, because it's not getting sponged up by Congress, is oozing into the groundwater across the country, and there are a lot of different reasons for it, but part of it is the cable news thing that thinks it's just much cheaper and easier to produce segments about abstract differences between good guys and bad guys than it is to talk about the water rights in Lake Erie or something like that. And the nationalization of the culture is, I think, the offshoot of all of this. And I don't know how you denationalize the culture in a way that is healthy.
No, my sense too. I mean, we just think about Congress for a minute. We're going to be running a number of essays from a congressional scholar, Joseph Postel at Hillsdale College, on this question. How do you go about reforming Congress, and how do you make it political again? I think a challenge for conservatism. If you think about successes that conservatives have had over the last 40 years, I think one of them clearly is in the judiciary, and it's the sort of takeover of originalism, and originalism even now becoming the way in which progressive scholars want to make their arguments. Now, they have a very different understanding of originalism, Jack
Right.
Balkin among others, but it's there, and it shows how powerful it's become. And yet, the challenge I think now for originalism is to help reinforce and invite Congress back into the constitutional argument and debate as an institution. And so you've seen the Chief Justice and certain opinions, and clearly the major questions doctrine does this. Chevron should do this. Because otherwise, we are now increasingly watching a Congress that's becoming like, I don't know, an audience that
Right.
recognizes or gives approval or disapproval to things that are happening, but doesn't shape or forge debate or legislation in any substantive sense. So my sense to help reinvigorate it is, the basic things have to reemerge. There has to be a committee system. There has to be sort of members themselves are not just a vote for a huge piece of legislation that originates in the party leader's office, but actually moves through the committee structure, and each member has more power and has an opportunity to actually participate in the debate. What I keep reading from people who are much more students of Congress than I am is that isn't happening.
Yeah.
So the basic things like that have to happen, and that's easier said than done. There also has to be just sort of basic willpower and a desire yourself to have a certain amount of pride in your job and what you're in Washington there to do, other than to be, just a purely messaging person, or you introduce bills just for the sake of messaging, or you want to be in the media or things like that. I mean, the whole Marjorie Taylor Greene or Matt Gaetz or others, just picking on certain Republicans who see themselves that that's their central role. They don't have policy people, they have comms people, and that's it. That's sort of the problem of Congress right now. It's also a case too of, and think about the sainted late James Buckley, removing federal power from state and local affairs and bringing the states back into a much more robust system of competitive federalism, as opposed to the progressive idea that we've been living with and live with now, which is cooperative federalism. The states and federal government are in some sort of partnership to divide
Right.
spoils and rents and govern together. And we need to have a more competitive system. And that necessarily invites responsibility on behalf of state officials as they govern. So that's why, like, just a policy question, like, if the Trump administration is going to make it a focus to rescind the SALT tax deduction, that's a mistake. That's been one of the biggest boons to competitive federalism that stemmed from Trump's first year in 2017. That tax package makes blue states honest in terms
Hmm.
of the high income taxes they assess against people. So those are all sorts of things that are in the air that, if done, could help reinvigorate politics at this deliberative level.
All right, so let's move to my work back into my comfort zone about conservative eggheadery for a second.
Yeah.
I was recently talking to Eli Lake. He had me on his podcast to do some of my greatest hits about Woodrow Wilson being a bad man, and I'm happy to show you all the places on the doll where Woodrow Wilson touched me if we want to do that. But that's not what I want to talk about. Um, uh, uh, the I was telling him something about one of the things I was really surprised by or confused by when I first started working on my first book and discovering, for at least for myself, all the stuff about Wilson was I would go through the old National Review archives and very little about Woodrow Wilson in the 1950s and 60s. Very little, to be honest, about the progressive era. It's basically the dawn of the conservative tale of America's fall from grace and exile from Eden really starts with the New Deal. And the weird thing about that is that the New Deal was really just the Wilson administration on steroids, right? It was the
Mm.
continuation to its logical conclusion of all of the stuff, and the libertarians have been very good about this stuff for a very long time. The New Deal was Woodrow Wilson's war socialism institutionalized, and yet you got this nostalgia, and I have my theories for why this is the case, but I'm curious, what is your explanation? Why is it that you think, I mean, like, it is now something of a accepted truth among people like you and me and Steve Hayward and the Claremontsters and others that the progressive era was really the second revolution in America. It is the thing that started us on this path. We talked about mandates. It's what introduces really the primary system. It's Wilson's the first guy to run against the Bill of Rights and the Constitution. It introduces the living Constitution in. It creates the administrative state. It creates all sorts of other things like that. And yet, that the critique of those things doesn't begin until the New Deal era, if then. What is your theory as to why that's the case?
As to why conservatives running in the post-World War II period did not immediately.
Yeah, why didn't they go? Why do they stop the telescope at the 1930s rather than go back to the 1910s and 1920s?
My sense of that is, if you look at the major, well, I will say Frank Meyer, like in a lot of his essays that are in the conservative mainstream, he seems to kind of clearly pick up the problem with progressivism. And someone we've been talking about, Wilmore Kendall, sees in progressive political scientists in the late 19th, early 20th century sort of the enthronement of egalitarianism.
Sure.
Which he says, and Abraham Lincoln kind of became their vehicle for doing that. So I think that's a false understanding of Lincoln, but that's neither here nor there. So my sense is Whittaker Chambers, Richard Weaver, Eric Voegelin, Leo Strauss are kind of the intellectual leaders of post-war conservatism and post-war thinkery, and they're all rooting it in the crisis of the West, the crisis of our time, the implosion of human dignity, of human meaning, of truth. And so they start looking to, Strauss famously looks to the onset of political modernity and Machiavelli. For Richard Weaver, it's
William of Ockham.
The monk, William of Ockham, introducing nominalist epistemology, and then you've got Whittaker Chambers, right? It's the lie in the garden of good, of good and evil.
And I think
that's the root of communism. Yeah. So, and Voegelin is, we can't live in the metaxy.
Right.
Yeah. And we can't live in the in between. And so we're trying to perfect humanity, et cetera, et cetera. So I think that's the way I think about it. If you look at it's one of the chapters, kind of the quest for order in George Nash's book, The Post-War History of the Intellectual Conservative Movement. He says they never come to an agreement about why we're in this pickle. But in a way, he says they do kind of forge an agreement around it's the loss of meaning and truth and philosophic modernity. That's kind of what they all agree on. But then what that loss entails is a source of contention.
Yeah, no, that's a perfectly good point, right? It's that the one way to put that is that they have their short range binoculars and they look back to FDR. And then they have their long-range telescope, and they look back to the decline of Athens and Jerusalem, right? But there's something just a little over the next hill from FDR, which is like the Wilson years. And my own theory about it is it has more to do with the politics of the 1950s. Is that, first of all, most of those guys were communists, or not all, most. A lot of those guys were communists back then, right? And they started moving rightward because, later, I'm talking about like the Burnham types and even Frank Meyer and others. So National Review was founded right at the tail end of the Red Scare, the second Red Scare. And to be condemnatory of the architects of the first Red Scare is politically problematic. And to look back and say all of those people who were making Christianity central to their politics were part of the problem is very difficult for like the author of God and Man at Yale.
Mhm.
And so I part of it is, I think, sort of the politics of nostalgia for something that really was only, like a generation ago, right? I mean, like the 1910s and 1920s were for that generation what the 1990s and the aughts are for us today. And I just don't think they could get outside of it enough to realize
Yeah.
that that's where this thing started.
Yeah.
And so they picked up the movie halfway in with the New Deal and the New Deal court and, and
Yeah.
Lochner and all that kind of stuff.
Yeah. No, it's also, as I'm listening to you, I'm thinking, the presidencies of Warren Harding and Calvin Coolidge were successful repudiations of Woodrow Wilson.
Right, right.
And, really, I mean, of course, the way progressives tell it, Calvin Coolidge moved us into the Depression. I don't think that's true. But they were able to dismantle the federal government machinery that Woodrow Wilson built, and particularly Warren Harding. They put down that first Red Scare. Calvin Coolidge gives us something like, early supply side tax cut theory and sort of the moralization of business and entrepreneurship and all those sorts of good things. So my sense too is Woodrow Wilson, who
Right.
might be evident also.
Yeah. Also, I mean, and the rule in this podcast is if you start denigrating Calvin Coolidge, you're on the fighting side of me.
Well,
But
that's a good rule.
he also gives us the third best, speech ever on the Declaration of Independence.
It is, and a wonderful signing veto message on the Agricultural Adjustment Act.
Oh, that's right. What was it?
That in a sense we're not going to need as many farmers because of production and machinery. That's okay. You can move. you can do something else, and it's good. It's good for the country, and so accept it. And also, I love the way Ebony Schlaze in her biography of Calvin Coolidge points to sort of his thrift, both in his personal life and his awareness of a government spending, but also of private debt and taking on large amounts of private debt by individual consumers for consumer goods. He's reticent about that, and I appreciate that as we continue to watch Americans spend a lot of money. I think there's a connection between the debt in private American lives and the debt our federal government carries as well. As Calvin Coolidge would say, we need to discipline our appetite.
So actually, when I invited you to come on here because I wanted to pick up on something from the panel we had done for the Fund for American Studies together, you had guessed it was about Wilmar Kendall, but it wasn't. But you reminded me that I want to talk about that too. What I did want to talk to you about was, and I wish I could remember the thinker that you most associated it with, but you said something that stuck with me that I had not thought of or really heard before, which is that the intellectual conservatism has had within it for a very long time an apocalyptic sense.
Yeah.
And I'm wondering if you could explain that, because that kind of clanged off my ear at the time, but then I was like, maybe he's right, as I thought about it, because one of my great complaints about this moment is the rampant apocalypticism everywhere and the catastrophization of everything. But your point was it was ever thus to a certain extent, and I'm very sympathetic to those kinds of arguments. So why don't you just sort of make your case?
Yeah, no, as someone who's really, Whittaker Chambers really recruited my soul to conservative thinking and to this project of standing up for America and culture and civilization. This was a man who was invested with an apocalyptic mindset, and it's all through the pages of Witness and how he understood his life and what his life meant after he had left communism. And so I've always thought that's an awareness on the part of American conservatives in a way we don't really find in what you might think of as conservatives in Europe or Western Europe, that we could lose everything. And the people that we are arguing with, many of them mean for us to lose everything, both in their anthropology and their metaphysics and their understandings of political power and centralization. They really do want something that reality can't give them. Now, they would be destined to lose, but if, when they lose, like Cuba or North Korea or the Soviet Union, they destroy everything. And so it's hard to put it back together again. And if you look at these thinkers, I mean, if you think about Eric Voegelin, who we touched on, there is something afoot in late modernity that recognizes no limits on human nature, on reality, and that seeks to, in effect, command them with an ideology of perfectionism, of immanentism. Leo Strauss said that communism is the fulfillment of modernity. So this, in terms of at the level of thinking, that's always been there. At the level of men like McCarthy, and I don't want McCarthy and Chambers are two very different people. But in terms of these certain political battles, certain political moments, it's always been there formatively. So if we think about even the presidency of Ronald Reagan and the way in which he took on the Soviet Union and some of his major speeches that he was reviled for, when he calls them the evil empire and looks to them as potentially the ability to end life on Earth because of communism. He's aware of this, and he was also, as the new film brings out, right? He was a reader of Chambers. So this is part of it, but then also the rough with the smooth. There's also a downside there that I have not been aware of in my career until the last few years, but it's something that we have to be aware of, and it's this sense that we too can put too much weight on the system, even as conservatives in the goals that we pursue, and forget that our constitutional system, which is heavily reliant, I think, on civil society and education to perpetuate our free society, can itself come undone if we don't recognize its own limits and our own imperfections. And so if you think, for me, it's like being in college. I was in college during the Clinton presidency. I thought Clinton was, evil incarnate. It turns out, on further reflection, he really wasn't. I mean, there were certain things he did as a statesman that were not helpful to our country. But he also put together this consensus that could have reformed our entitlement structure that was lost with the breakout of the Lewinsky scandal. If we think about the ways in which the opposition to Obama, and I think you don't get Trump without Obama, and the ways that Obama handled himself, that's true. But the high watermark for elected Republican officials was 2015. At state level, local level, federal level, the Republicans had fielded an incredible number of people in elected office. The Democratic Party was at a low point. And our conclusion from that was we're about to lose our country, and we've got to get our own guy in who is incredibly powerful and capable of shaking up the system. And that sort of led to this logic of Donald Trump. Donald Trump can fix it. And so I guess in all of these sort of events, as I've reflected on them, it seems, take the rough with the smooth. There's a radical part of conservatism that wants to go to the roots of intellectual and spiritual dysfunction. I think that's good. But we also need to recognize that in that certainty, there's our own seeds of disorder.
Yeah, I mean, there's a strain among, given I have friends scattered all over the place, and I can only imagine you have more. I've been curating my friends of the last 10 years, and I don't want to get you in trouble with anybody, but among Japhaites, we can call them that, right? So because I think there's a schism, and some have gone very, very Trumpy, and some have not, right? And it's one of the explanations that I've heard from a few different people is that for the ones who've gone very, very Trumpy, the argument is that Jaffaite argument about needing the statesman to suspend the rules to preserve the union, that person who sort of steps out of time to uphold the highest things, you can't spend a career justifying that until you just start craving it. And so they projected upon Trump that sort of role. That's sort of what the Flight 93 election stuff is kind of about. But if you haven't taken that pill, whatever color pill that is, it just seems absurd to say, okay, what we need is a great statesman. Aha, here's the guy from The Apprentice. He's the great statesman. But I think there's something to that, right? There is this desire to live in a moment of great politics is very seductive for intellectuals. And sometimes they try to create a moment that it doesn't need to be, precisely so they can have that kind of role in it.
Yeah. I see, and I'm not a Claremontster. I mean, I've read the Claremont Review of Books. I've been intellectually enlarged by Harry Jaffe's scholarship, particularly his first book, Charles Kessler's essays. I'm working on a long essay right now on Charles Kessler's writings, because I think he's sort of an interesting voice of wisdom.
Charles is a long friend of mine. We have our disagreements, but he's a brilliant guy.
Yeah. And I think about, living in Indianapolis in 2015, when the great freak out over Mike Pence and the Religious Freedom Restoration Act. And we see all the smart people and the pretty people and the wealthy people unite to condemn this one state and Mike Pence over the Religious Freedom Restoration Act that Indiana that he had signed for the state, which major constitutional scholars were saying would not be interpreted in any way, shape, or form different from the federal RFRA, meaning it didn't pose some sort of offensive weapon against gay people. But the breathless argument was made there. That intrusion, the way Obergefell v. Hodges, among other things, left conservatives thinking we are on the back foot here, and it doesn't seem to be getting any better. And then, of course, there's also a foreign policy component of the Republican Party, never really repudiating but criticizing what had happened and in the Second Iraq War and the thinking that went up to that, and everybody just sort of said there's got to be something else out there. That's kind of how that's my take on that moment. My sense is as well here, there's sort of a disgust with American culture among some scholars. It's not something that I'm entirely immune from, but also a failure to recognize certain constitutional limits over what can be done about that, and also a failure to recognize that, as I hear a lot of conservatives, people now say, if you're pro-family, you've got to support all these new pro-family policies, which are basically just recapitulations of what a lot of European countries have done to try to increase their birth rates. Particularly Hungary is now seen as a lodestar. None of it has really proven that successful. Hungary, I think, spends something like close to 8% of its GDP on these policies, and it doesn't really seem to work. But my point being, Americans did largely accept the sexual revolution, largely accepted a lot of things that you find disgusting, and you got to ask yourself, well, what does that mean? And what does that mean for my arguments and policies and how I calibrate things? It may be that as we start to deal with things like the decreasing birth rate and all sorts of societal disorder that are evident from these things, that we start to question it some and move away from it. I don't know, but it can't be the situation that you sort of lurch for a strong man who you think is going to put everything back together again. And then so, my sense is, apart from all of these debates about conservatism, the question remains: progressives have been successful in there are certain moments, 1932, 1964, by joining policies, ideas, and institutions to how you should think of yourself as an American citizen. And conservatism, to my mind, has never really done that. And that explains, Reagan came the closest, but even Reagan in the farewell address admits sort of that he failed. That in a way the institutions and the thinking in broad reaches of American life continues to move away from his ideal. And that says to me, we need an American statesmanship that isn't a strong man. It's an American statesmanship that thinks coherently about rooting citizens into ideas of constitutionalism, citizenship, and then the policies and major speeches that could reorient that. And I don't see that being on the menu. What I see is, I have a lot of thoughts about what I'm seeing in the early Trump transition period, but it's not that thing. And that's really, if conservatism is going to finally break out and have sort of an enduring transformational moment, it's got to do those sorts of things. I mean, Obama, for all the things that we kind of laugh at a lot of his speeches, he was trying to do that.
Right.
I think he failed in terms of trying to recreate the second New Deal or have a third New Deal or whatever. He wanted to bring in new life to these formulas, and he failed, which is also a measure of conservative success in its own way, and a recognition that these policies just have a certain shelf life. But here we are. Here we are with this sort of very aggressive form of politics.
But I mean, it isn't embedded in your. I mean, I don't want to overstate this, but maybe conservatives should just stop looking to the presidency for as the
Yeah,
thing that is going to deliver this stuff. Um,
yeah,
if Reagan couldn't do it, if Obama couldn't do it, right? I mean,
yeah,
Obama was trying to do it and failed, and maybe you know when I agree with you when you said some scholars see some things in the culture that are disgusted by. I see some things in the culture that I am disgusted by. We don't have to list the things I'm disgusted by, but
yeah,
um, um, uh, it does. There's an underpants known problem, right? I'm disgusted with step one. I'm just expressed disgust with the state of current culture. Step two, question mark, question mark, question mark. Step three, the idea that embracing, Ghostbusters style, the form of the destructor of these things, the thrice married
yeah,
adulterer, porn star shopping guy, as
yeah,
a way to fight the decay and decadence
yeah,
of American culture just strikes me as a disconnect. I mean, there's a prominent post-liberal guy. I don't know if to give his name, but who is going around who reviewed Suicide of the West as saying, "I represent everything that is decadent about American life and politics these days. Been married for 23 years." Never cheated on my wife. I stand up for bourgeois values all the time. And this guy was defending Donald Trump,
yeah, yeah,
tooth and claw. And there's a weird disconnect in
yeah,
hearing these lectures from people who are willing to countenance their
yeah,
King Cyrus, as it were.
yeah. So it seems to me, strangely, the American conservative formula of we actually want to move the federal government out of being in the whip hand and control of, say, 30% of GDP, having all manner of control in state and local government through funding and grants and all this sort of business. We actually don't want to have a judiciary that's redefining terms in the Constitution. All of that seems to lead to the politics that makes what we're seeing right now a surplusage. I guess the question is how do we get there, and how do you show people that when it hasn't been evident in this country now for many decades. But I think that formula, so the future has to be federalism and separation of powers for the entire purpose of reinvigorating self-government, civil society, and the opportunity to chart the promise of American life, Herbert Crowley, the promise of American life is to stand on your own 2 feet
Mm-hmm.
and to live in community, to raise strong families, to worship, to work, to get ahead, whatever, and all of those sorts of things. That's the promise of American life, and putting that back together requires the old constitutional formula, the perennial constitutional formula, that recognized how the Constitution balances or fits the relational aspects of human nature. That's what we're working for here, and it's precisely being so off course as we have been that you start to get these strange manifestations that we're dealing with.
Yeah. So I don't know if you followed the. We can after we've spent sufficient, or at least a necessary, maybe not sufficient for my taste, time bashing the right. We might as well
Yeah,
do a little more bashing on the left here. I don't know if you followed the reports about the DNC meeting where they were picking their new leader, and the and just more broadly the degree to which the Democrats cannot accept the idea that, say, identity politics and immigration and these various things work against them electorally,
mm-hmm.
is really kind of amazing. And I do think it raises this sort of basic point, like we talked about mandates. the vast majority of people who, the vast majority of the people who won the election for Trump in terms of voters, right? Not the core who are going to vote for him no matter what, but the people who gave him his margin of victory over Kamala Harris. The vast majority of them did not vote for the stuff that Steve Bannon wants Trump to do. They voted to get inflation down, maybe deal with the border, a few other things, the economy, that kind of stuff. The Democrats are in this position where they're like, they cannot accept the fact that the reason they lost is because they were more concerned about, perceived to be, forget whether they were or not. Like their perception was they were more concerned about trans rights than they were about getting inflation down. And it seems to me that the way you get back to a congressional majority in this country, and you get back to the idea of having a majority party, whether it's Republican or Democrat, is that whichever party can actually just, what's that word, govern competently, right? And that's one of the reasons to hope to have some optimism on the right, because some of the best governors in this country, including Ron DeSantis, there are a lot of things I can criticize Ron DeSantis for. He's a really freaking good governor. And if following that model is what turned Florida red. It wasn't the boob bait Fox News stuff. It was like being really good at being a governor. And like, that's the thing that I wish you could convince more. I think it would be good for the country, for both parties. If one party decided, hey, you know what we're going to do to get a comparative advantage? Be good at government stuff.
Oh, I agree entirely. And something that I think, and I think you probably agree with me as a student of progressivism, I think the reason why the Democrats can't let go of these certain notions like transgender ideology or identity politics and DEI, these sorts of things, is it's precisely their claim that it's the future and their hold on the future and their ability to understand the future that licenses progressivism. And if it looks like we aren't going to do that as a people, and the people who are the critical kind of margin of difference in saying we're not going to do it are actually racial minorities, that seems to indicate not only the end of the emerging Democratic majority thesis, but sort of their overall historical understanding of their power. And they just can't let that go. I mean, it was sort of amazing to watch that congressman from Massachusetts, Seth Moulton, try to go out on a limb and say this, and instantly he's rejected. I think the chairman of the Texas Democratic Party did too the day after the election, and he had to resign immediately. So there's real resistance. But I think that's what the resistance is rooted in, just like all this stuff about, I mean, we can go on and on about elections, but like the Stacey Abrams stuff about voting and why we can't have voter ID. And it's because the voting itself is like a socioeconomic collective right to achieve a progressive end, and it shall not be impeded in any way, certainly not for something like making sure the votes are fair and impartial and all that sort of business. So my sense is that's good. And I think Florida proves this. I think Texas proves this as well, that competent governors bring in larger majorities into the party. And so as Florida has had enormous movements of people into the state from across the country, I think there was a fear initially, I think in a lot of red states, that people from California would move there, but then would stupidly vote progressive. That hasn't happened. And then also we have a lot of people from South America and Florida, second generation immigrants, third generation immigrants, children of them who are voting Republican. And one of the reasons is wow, this is a really nice thing we've got going here, and we don't want to mess it up. And we know what happened where we're from when these policies were implemented on a more radical scale. So,
I mean, I agree with all of that. I will say that, like, again, I love intellectual history. I love philosophy stuff. I am more and more I'm inclined to not go first to those explanations for a whole bunch of different reasons we don't have to get into. But like, I think one of the factors is also just simply that, if all you have is the old phrase, if all you have is a hammer, everything's a nail. If your comparative advantage rising through the ranks of the sort of campus Democratic Party media complex has been your ability to articulate this very narrow band of ideas in that sort of intersectionality, identity politics realm, and that's what you do for a living. The idea that, oh no, actually the Democratic Party is going to really focus on fighting crime, right? Or we're going to like,
No,
you're
that's
like,
true.
what? I don't even
Yeah.
speak. It's like finding out, like you're a professional French translator, and then all of a sudden the English king says, all of our courts are now going to be in the vernacular, English, and you're like, no, we can't do that for these high-minded reasons. When in reality, it's like, I got to pay the rent, right?
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
the best example of this, I mean, I just was writing about this recently, to my mind, is when Kamala Harris got sworn in as vice president. She gets her intelligence briefings, and she's really disturbed by the misuse of some pronouns and the adjectives used for some female leaders that weren't used for male leaders. And she says she demands a thorough review of the intelligence briefings to find out that, and I'm 100% willing to believe that there were some troubling adjectives and misuse of pronouns somewhere in an intelligence briefing about Burkina Faso or something. That's fine.
Yeah.
Stipulated. Yeah. But that's all she knows how to talk about, right? And that's how she rose through Democratic politics. And I have this problem on this podcast is I want to talk about the things I know how to talk about. Yeah. Politicians want to make the issues the things that they know how to talk about. And the Democratic Party has lost 2 generations of professionals who know how to talk about like fighting crime or holding, or getting good results from schools that, aren't measured by how many pay increases you give to teachers unions. And it's going to take, there was a reason why the Israelites had to walk in the wilderness for 40 years, because to get a certain mindset out of them. I don't think it'll take that long with Democrats, but I think that's a big part. It's a sociological problem. It's a sort of public choice theory problem.
My sense, I don't disagree with what you're saying. I would kind of fold it into, but it became a problem precisely because of the ideology itself.
I agree with that.
But as the anchoring point of who they are and how they understand themselves, just like how they understand constitutionalism. I mean, what are you talking about limits? What are you talking about original public meaning or understandings of that were evident at the Congress that passed the 14th Amendment? Why does that matter? What matters are these sort of milestones we put down in place. That's how we think about the Constitution. And then to go back on those is itself the abomination, which helps you understand why you would leak the Dobbs opinion, burn down the Supreme Court, threaten justices. It's precisely because you are threatening progressive constitutionalism at its source that sparks these, intransigent, if not violent, reactions.
All right, so we're coming up on the end of our time here. I don't think I got a declarative answer on this. I mean, do you think? Let me put it this way. Going back to the beginning, what is the future of conservatism? Do you think it's going to revert back to the mean about being a fundamentally fusionist project, which is socially conservative to one extent, but classically liberal or neoliberal, in the economic realm, or do you think that the path has been inalterably changed for the foreseeable future?
I think we are always. I mean, I think the American Constitution itself is a fusionist project. It's a fusionist project not only if we go back, incredible divisions at that time in the late 18th century, incredible amount of philosophical, theological, political materials that they have to work with to forge a new constitutionalism. I mean, that's why when you read these wonderful early Republic speeches by like George Washington's farewell address, if you read their correspondence, the way they are thinking not only about sort of these bedrock ideas of constitutionalism, but how we're going to forge the American people through patriotism, through Republican virtue and Republican citizenship. They're trying to elevate our thinking to philosophical, if not transcendent, reference points to ground American constitutionalism. I think that project needs life and needs reinvigoration in our time, and needs to be done by conservatives precisely to remind us why we are conservatives and what it is that we're trying to conserve. And so if that becomes more a part of who we are and how we think about ourselves, if the American constitutional tradition is what we understand ourselves to be engaged in, then we will not only, I think, be in continuity with the post-war tradition, but but even make it better and improve it and help to sort of create, conservative majorities that aren't just winning elections, but are changing the way people are thinking about who they are as Americans in a salutary way. If it becomes sort of the Kevin Roberts project, that is, the leading statesman is Viktor Orban, and we measure ourselves by the degree to which we can be incredibly socially conservative and use government to reinvigorate and use economic policy to reinvigorate institutions. Now, he is now calling for a one-income family policy. That's going to require a tremendous amount of federal government intervention to make possible. If that becomes the locus of what it means to be conservative, then I think that will not be as helpful, to put it mildly. But what I see, hopefully, what I would hope happen is kind of the constitutional education project moving in tandem with economic growth, civil society growth, originalism continuing to do its good work, and reinvigorating self-government as sort of the muscle that we need to re-exercise and grow again. I think those are the ways in which conservatism can heal itself in this present moment, make the most of our success in the present moment, and then kind of move forward. But I think the ways in which we come apart is if one group, and right now that seems to be the group with all the moxie and the strength, seems to be the populist group. If they don't do what Wilmer Kendall did, which is he was a populist of sorts, but he's a populist that connects it to constitutional rules, right, processes, and traditions. And in particular, his scholarship is all about the Federalist Papers being the working philosophy of our Constitution. If that sort of reference point is cut out because we want to own the libs and all those sorts of things, then that would be most unfortunate.
Yeah, I think it's somewhat unfortunate that he's associated with populism, because his populism was of a different order, and it was
much higher order.
Yeah, it was much higher order. It was like he liked populism as channeled through a functioning Congress, which is just a different thing than what we're than populism as channeled through the Fox News green room.
Right. yeah, definitely. And and also he has this thing, the 5 great documents of America, of the American political tradition. It's the Constitution, the Declaration, the Federalist Papers, the Constitutional Convention debates, and and sort of all of the scholarship, not scholarship, but the correspondence of our founders. Those are the things that you need to be in touch with to locate you as an American conservative, help you understand your project. That has to be constantly stressed by those of us who have this great opportunity to write and speak and go around and talk to people about these things.
All right, Richard Reinsch, thank you so much for doing this. Again, you are the grand poobah of the Civitas Institute, and
that's Ryan Streeter. That's
I'm sorry, I apologize. You're the editor-in-chief of the. And we can both admit right now. Ryan Streeter has very, very important hair, and it's very intimidating hair. But beyond that, I wish you nothing but luck and success, and and hopefully you'll come back on.
Jonah, thank you so much. This has been wonderful. I really appreciate it. Thank you for all your kind words and helping us spread the word about the Civitas Institute.